Hi everybody, my name is Jessie and I'm the ResourceSmart Facilitator for Whitehorse, Manningham and Boroondara LGAs. I do this through the Eastern Alliance of Sustainable Learning, and it's our goal to put out more content to help you in your ResourceSmart journey. So as a bird nerd myself, I thought I'd take this opportunity to put out a quick bird ID guide for beginners to help you in your biodiversity audits and if you're conducting any bird surveys through citizen science projects for your school. I wanted to start off with some important bird history and acknowledge firstly that songbirds originated from and radiated out from Australia. So all the songbirds that we are so lucky to have here are the starting point for songbirds around the world, and that's really exciting. I also want to acknowledge that the bird names especially are very deeply colonized here, and a lot of our birds are named after English birds that are not at all related to the birds here. So for instance, our magpies are totally different birds from the magpies you see in the Northern Hemisphere. They have the reputation of being really smart corvid birds. Our magpies are really related to the butcher birds and a totally different species. So I want to acknowledge that if our birds were named properly, or if we still used Indigenous names, it would tell us a lot more about the life history and about the behavior and traits of the birds we have than their current names of English origin. And with this, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Australia and their connection to naming, conserving and understanding not just the bird species, but all wildlife, flora and fauna within our country. And I'm coming to you through this presentation from Wurundjeri. I would like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to extend that acknowledgement to the lands of wherever you're watching from today. So firstly, when you're going to look at birds, you need to equip yourself with some different tools to help make your life a bit easier. So when you think of bird watching, a lot of people think of binoculars, which are great to see birds that are a bit far away. But if you're just starting out in bird ID, it's really good to have a camera so you can identify the birds later. It's really convenient if you have a picture that you can use against a field guide or an app as a reference, because if you don't know your birds as well as you'd like to, it will be hard if you see one and you can't identify it even through the binoculars because you have no idea what it is. Usually in a school setting, the birds will be close enough that you can use an iPad or just a phone if you're a teacher, so you won't have to worry about having a fancy lens. But if you have one at home, it could be a really cool time to bring one out and take close-ups of the birds to show your students. So any Australian bird field guide will be useful, but also apps are becoming more and more useful now as well. iNaturalist is a really good app to take photos of different species and it will help you identify it. But there's also apps out there like Bird Data and eBird that you can use. And these are also good if you want to input citizen science as well. And you need something to record your bird findings on. So a clipboard and paper is always really good to keep a list of the birds and how many that you've seen. So the biodiversity audit actually only includes native birds. So I have compiled a list of birds that you might commonly see that you have to keep out of your audit, so not include. So these are birds that are introduced and they come from Asia, the northern countries in the Northern Hemisphere, and these are the common starling. You can tell by their metallic-y sheen in the light. They have those speckles. They can look actually quite stunning if you get them in the right light, and in other lights they can just look like black birds. Their pointy yellow or orange beak is a really good indicator. But if you look at the bird below that, the common blackbird, it might get a bit confusing. It's also black with a bright orange beak. So really look out for the metallic feathers of the common starling. Then you have your traditional pigeon. It's called a rock dove. I feel like a lot of people know what a pigeon looks like, but the spotted dove looks a bit like them, except for they have that spotted scarf neck area, and they actually originate from Asia. We then have the Indian myna, which I think most people in Victoria are very common with. They have the orange eye and beak, and then they have the brown, white, and black body. We have the house sparrows, which are tiny little birds that you can find commonly hopping around your feet at cafes in the city. And then you have, if you have ponds or waterways near your school, on your school grounds, you might have Eurasian coots, which are black water birds with a bright red eye, and they have that white beak. So these are some of the birds that are not from Australia, not native to Australia, and that you should leave out of your audit if you see them, because they're not included. So I talked about how there's pigeons, and everybody knows what pigeons are, and not to include those two types of doves, but we actually have two native doves that you can include. So the first one is the common bronzewing, and I have put here the male and female forms, but as you can see, they have really distinct bright colors. They have that metallic-y sheen on their feathers, and these guys can mostly be found walking around the understory of a park or, I guess, bushland, but they are way more common than you think. You just usually are walking along a path and you see a flurry of birds fly into the air, and it's often these guys here. So the female, as you'll notice with a lot of birds, are more drab than the male birds, which are more brightly colored. And this is just due to sexual selection and the males having to put on a show to impress the females. We also have the crested pigeon, which you can notice by its little mohawk, and that's probably the easiest tell. But yeah, the crested pigeons are native as well. So there are two types of doves that you can leave out and two types of doves, these guys, that you can include in your survey. And these are both pretty common as well. So I said we are going to leave out the Indian miners, but there's two types of native miners that we are going to include. There's the noisy miner, which are very, very common birds. They are bullies, and actually BirdLife and other people or other organisations in Australia are sometimes commissioned to cull noisy miners, because when forests get too degraded, noisy miner populations really boom, and they are so territorial that they often kick out other bird species. So you know that if there's noisy miners in your area, you probably have a more degraded area, and that you're probably going to have a lower biodiversity than if you didn't have noisy miners there. Then we have the bell miner, which, as it sounds, goes ting ting, and often you think when you're walking down a path there's a bike coming and you habitually move out of the way, but it's just a bell miner. So these are pretty easy to tell apart. The noisy miners are grey and the bell miners are a bright yellowy green, and they sound completely different as well. Both miners are a type of honeyeater, which is why they're so popular. They love to eat the nectar of all the beautiful plants and trees we plant around our cities and urban landscapes to make them more beautiful. So this is really good all year round food for the miners, and why they do so well. And yeah, as I said before, noisy miners are one of the only native birds to be considered a pest, to the extent that they're culled as much as invasive species. So that if you ever get annoyed with noisy miners, you have every right to be. Okay, now we're moving on to honeyeaters. So we have a few here, and I think honeyeaters are the biggest group of birds in Australia. There are so many different types of honeyeaters, but these are the most common ones that you'll see. You have the New Holland honeyeater, which is, I guess, a really great example of what I was talking about before of bird names being deeply colonized. So back when Australia was called New Holland, maybe that's when these guys were first spotted. But they can be characterized by the black and white speckledy stripes on their breast, and the pop of yellow on their wing. There's the yellow-faced honeyeater, which is pretty self-explanatory. It just has a yellow face. And types of honeyeaters that are not called honeyeaters, but are still honeyeaters, are the red wattlebird, which is characterized by the yellow tongue, and the red wattles that hang on their neck, and then the little wattlebird, which is easy to identify because it looks really similar, it just doesn't have those red wattles. So these are commonly found in, the wattlebirds, sorry, are commonly found in urban built up areas, whereas the New Holland and yellow-faced honeyeater are more found where there's a bit more scrubland and bushland. So if you have more woody middle story on your school, you might be lucky enough to see them, but there's probably a high chance you can see wattlebirds around your schoolyard. So these little birds come from a range of different families. So I've just categorized them as miscellaneous little birds, but there's a chance you may be able to see some of these guys around your school. the thing is, little birds really highlight diversity. So the more types of these species, the better your habitat is. If you're in a part of your school that is really like foresty, bushy, has a lot of trees, you might be able to get these guys in. But if it's a high traffic area like a playground or a courtyard, you may not be able to see these species. So we start with the eastern yellow robin. Again, not a robin. That name is a result of the colonization and comparing these birds to birds from the Northern Hemisphere. But either way, it's a bird that's very distinct because it has that bright yellow breast and grey body. Then you have brown thornbills, which I cannot stress how tiny these are. You definitely need a pair of binoculars or a camera to see these, but they are the tiny little specks that sometimes you see darting around in the top of the tree canopy. They are very, very, very small. Then you have the red-browed finch. These usually hang out in flocks. A big bunch of finches usually move together. So when there's one, there will most likely be others. And they are strongly characterized by their nice red eyeliner and beak. The eastern spinebill has a very long spine. You'll be hard for a very long bill, sorry. You'll be very hard pressed to find a bird that has that long a bill, but it's a very distinct coloration. It's that tawny orangey brown with the black and white stripes down the face. Then you have white eyes, which I have seen in built up urban areas, just outside on streets in suburban trees. So white eyes are characterized by the white circle around their eye, and that's what makes them the most distinct, because there are a lot of gray, brown, drab colored birds, which does make it hard to tell them apart. But that white eye is a giveaway for the white eye, as the name suggests. Then you have the spotted pardalote, which is another really, really small bird, about the size of a thornbill. You need binoculars or a camera to see these guys, but they actually nest on the ground. So they're usually hopping around in like the understory down by tree roots, and they're definitely characterized, as their name suggests, by all of their spots and their bright orange underbelly. Then we move on to wrens. So there's two common wrens that you might see around your area. There's the superb fairy wren, and these are, I think, fairly well known. You have the males with the bright blue feathers, and then you have the more drab females in the brown. But these are the most common wrens that you'll see. Then you have the white-browed scrub wren, and they always hide in the understory in the really dark areas of like woody undergrowth. So usually you see a little dude darting about, but unless you like have binoculars or a camera and you manage to see it close up, you may not see that it's a scrub wren because they're always darting around in dark places. But as the name suggests, they have a white brow that makes them a bit more distinct. Then we move on to fantails and wagtails. So really common in urban areas is a willy wagtail. They do wag their tails in a nice fun dance, but they are just black and white top-deck birds. I put one in a nest as well because I think it's really cute that they build nests that like just fit them in. And when you have babies, as soon as the babies grow up, nobody fits in the nest anymore. But you might even be lucky enough to find a willy wagtail nesting on your schoolyard, because they do nest in quite urban areas as well. Then you have your fantails. The grey fantail is more popular. I see them all over the place, and they, like the wagtails, have a very prominent tail, but this one fans out. They also have a white little eyebrow, which you can see makes them very distinct. If you're in the Yarra Ranges, you might be able to see a rufous fantail, but these are way more rare, and they like to have inhabit like more darker understory as well. So if you are a school in the Yarra Ranges and you do have a bit of bushland on your property, on your schoolyard, you might get lucky enough to see these rufous fantails, which, as the name suggests, have a bit of a rufous back and a speckled front. Now we move on to lorikeets and rosellas. So a lot of people don't know this, but rainbow lorikeets are actually the most common bird in Australia. You might think it's noisy miners or pigeons or something, but we have planted our urban landscapes in a way that have continuously flowering plants all year round, which is what they eat. So there's nothing really food-wise that restricts their population growth. So they have just boomed over the years as we have planted out our urban landscapes. So rainbow lorikeets are a really, really common bird. They're very loud and a lot of people are very familiar with them because of their bright plumage. Musk lorikeets also you find in similar landscapes in areas to rainbow lorikeets. They occupy the similar niches, but the musk lorikeets can be identified by that red stripe that goes across the front of the face and the blue cap on the head. Then you have rosellas. There's two types of rosellas that you might see around. There's the eastern rosella with the cute white cheeks, and then you have the crimson rosella, which, as the name suggests, is mainly a red bird with some blue feathers as well. So these guys are all parrots. They're very loud, boisterous, and yeah, they love to eat the little seeds, nuts, and the nectar flowering plants. And yeah, I think everybody, especially in schoolyards, I've seen kids get very excited to see more brightly colored birds when they're used to seeing a lot of pigeons and magpies. So I thought I'd mention some other parrots you might see as well, especially around the Yarra Ranges. These will be more common, but also red rump parrots are really common around ovals because they like to pick at the grass seeds. So this is a type of parrot with strong sexual dimorphism, and sexual dimorphism literally just means that the males and females look different, have different morphs. So the female is pretty drab, light green brown, but the males are really bright green and turquoise, and they have a bright red rump, which is why they're called red rump parrots. Then you have the Australian king parrot, again, some sexual dimorphism where the male is bright crimson and it's beautiful deep emerald wings. And then you have the female with a green head and the colors are a bit more washed out and drab. Then we move on to our cockatoos. And cockatoos, again, love to feed grass seeds. You often find galahs and sulfur-crested cockatoos on ovals and on the side of the road because their beaks allow them to get into those tight nooks and crannies and crack open seeds. And actually sulfur-crested cockatoos are a bit of a nuisance and they like to pull and strip bark from the trees. So that is something that a lot of residents do not appreciate them for. Cockatoos are also very loud, so you know that they are around. So one of the most beloved cockatoos, I think, is the yellow-tailed black cockatoo. They're a bit more rare than the other species, but you can still see them around urban areas. They have the really cute yellow cheek and the yellow feathers underside the tail. The sulfur-crested cockatoo, which is the more common cockatoo, is plain white and it's got the yellow crest on the top, which gives it the sulfur-crested name. Then we have the gang cockatoo, which you might see. I've seen them around a lot of areas, but I'm not too sure you might find them in a school because they're a bit more elusive. But I'm sure, especially if you're in the Yarra Ranges, you might have some gangs around. They have a bright red head, which makes them distinct, and a grey black body. Then we have the long-billed corella and little corella, and you can tell these guys apart because the long-billed corella has that red stripe on its upper chest, but these guys are really loud and found all over all around urban areas as well, on power lines, in ovals, in park trees. So you have a high chance of finding these guys on your school. Then you have the iconic Australian galah. It's bright pink and grey with a white head, and you can find these guys grazing in grasses, especially on ovals as well. So they are all our cockatoos. So I didn't know how to classify these birds. Moving on, so I'm going to start using colours to help me through, because the thing is, Australian birds are part of such large families of birds, it's hard to break them down. So we have the grey butcher bird, and recently I was in a school talking about butcher birds and one kid mentioned them, and the student was talking about how they pick apart their prey and hang it over the trees like they are a butcher, and that's how they get their name. So it's pretty gruesome, but they sound a bit like magpies if you were to have a bird that was trying to imitate a magpie but got it slightly wrong. And that's because grey butcherbirds are magpies' close cousins, and they're very related. So if you hear something that sounds like a magpie, but not quite, is probably a grey butcherbird. Then a very iconic bird, we have the laughing koala. Also eats meat. It likes to eat skinks, lizards, snakes, and you find them hanging out in waterways. But also kookaburras are really interesting case study, because before COVID, a lot of people were feeding kookaburras and they were getting too friendly with humans and stealing sandwiches out of kids' mouths, cutting up their faces with their beaks. And after lockdown, everyone was shut down, locked inside and not outside feeding birds. Now there has been, in a lot of areas, a larger separation between kookaburras and people, which means that they have been able to revert back to their normal eating habits and their normal behavior. So this is a good example of why humans shouldn't be feeding birds, because it can really humanize them and make them more habituated, which can lead to some behavioral issues and conflicts when using shared spaces. So just keep that in mind. Then I wanted to go through the black and white birds. So we have two here. We have the magpie lark and the Australian magpie. So I come from South Australia, and the piping shrike is the icon, the state emblem. And there's nothing like, there's no such thing as a piping shrike. It is actually a magpie lark. So they're about half the size of a magpie. And I think magpies are very common. It's the first bird song we usually hear in the morning. They're a much larger bird, and I feel like a lot of Australians are very familiar with them. They have won Bird of the Year many times. So yeah, magpie lark, if you ever see a black and white bird and you're not sure, the magpie lark is always a lot smaller, and they have a green-white eye, and magpies have a red eye. Sometimes I see them with a blue eye as well. So yeah, as I was saying when I did my acknowledgement of country, magpies are not real magpies, and as I said before, they are more closely related to a butcherbird. And I think magpies are a good example of how, if we listen to a lot of media from the Northern Hemisphere, we may be led to believe that all magpies are corvid birds or really intelligent and pass all these behavioral tests, but our magpies are not corvid birds, so they don't have that heightened intelligence that the magpies do in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's really annoying if we want to learn more about our birds and we are listening to international content, because of the way our birds are named, we might get misled. Also, it's worth noting that magpies are carnivores. A lot of people put out seed mixes and nuts to feed magpies, but really we shouldn't be feeding birds, but if you do, they eat meat. Okay, I've labeled this section Big Black Birds because there's three that get confused quite a lot. Firstly, you have the little raven, which is what everybody says is crow. We actually don't have any crows in Australia, except for one that lives in only northern rainforests in Queensland. So I don't think anybody would experience them on a day-to-day basis. So what you think are crows are actually ravens. I've been asked by teachers before, how come in dreaming stories and in Aboriginal stories you hear about Wa being the crow? I think it's because the people who are translating these stories or writing these stories are using English terminology. So we have ravens here if you want to use the correct terminology. Then if you see a bird that looks like a raven but has some white underneath its tail and on the wings, it's called a currawong, pied currawong. I think currawongs speak in a really cute accent. I think they speak the equivalent of French. They have a really nice song, really nice accent, so you can tell them apart. Ravens like wah, wah, and currawongs have a really beautiful song. And then we have white-winged choughs, and they look a bit demonic and evil with their red eyes, and when they spread their wings open, you see white dots on their wings, which is how they get their name. And they build their nest out of clay. So I've put a picture here of a white-winged chough in its nest, and it's really bizarre when you see them. It's like you see just a clay pot, like somebody left their clay pot in a tree. So white-winged choughs are kind of mean birds. They like to use other birds as slaves. So they are as mean as they look with their demonic red eyes. So yeah, these are the three big black birds that you don't want to get mixed up. Okay. I didn't know how to title this either, so I just put it nighttime birds. Chances are you're not going to see an owl. If you do see an owl, then you can look up owls, but this is really the most common nighttime bird you're going to see during the day, and it's a tawny frogmouth. Tawny frogmouths are not owls, they're actually nightjars, and they're very, very good at camouflaging. I swear if you have a tree with 3 tawny frogmouths in it, you might not even see them at all when you're walking past. And I see these guys all over urban areas. So I see them on power lines, I see them in backyards, and I think most people in Australia are pretty familiar with tawny frogmouths. Okay, moving on to ducks. We have 3 common types of ducks that you see around urban areas and that you might find in your school. We have the Pacific black duck, which you can notice by its lovely black eyeliner, very beautiful. And I think a lot of people are familiar with this duck, they're very common. We then have the grey teal, which the males have that beautiful green head and the brown chest and the lighter brown feathers on top. And the females are really drab, just plain brown. And then we have the Australian wood duck, which I often see in trees. When I was in uni, I was obsessed with seeing ducks in trees. I thought it was such a novelty. But as I grew older, I just noticed that Australian wood ducks spend a lot more time in trees than they do on the ground. So you have the male with the dark brown head and the female with the light brown head. And I think you'll notice with ducks, there's always a strong sexual dimorphism in the coloring between males and females. So watch out for your students thinking that it's multiple types of ducks, but it just could be 2 grey teals, but just a male and a female. Okay, here I will blitz through the other water birds. So we have a mask lapwing. You can tell they have the bright yellow mask. These guys, I think some people call them plovers. Lapwings are a type of plover, but their most common name is a masked lapwing. Then we have dusky moorhens, which have the bright red beak, bright red legs, and they have feet that splay really big, like really long fingers and toes. They can often be confused with purple swamp hens, but purple swamp hens are much bigger. They have like much more of a red hard beak. It's more like hardware on their face, and they have that blue purple sheen to them. So they kind of look the same a bit, but purple swamp hens are much bigger. If you see a bird disappear underwater, as soon as you see it, disappear forever, it's probably the Australian grebe or a hoary-headed grebe, a type of grebe. But grebes are little water birds, really fluffy, that just disappear the second that you see them, and they'll pop up somewhere else underwater. I don't know if it would be common for you to find a grebe at a school, but some schools are really lucky enough to have a really large pond or a lake, and then you will definitely find grebes there. I think I've seen a grebe at one of my school visits. So you need a lot of water to have a grebe because that's where they like to hang out. Silver gulls are very common in Victoria. I think I see more silver gulls in the city than I see pigeons. So you could definitely have some hanging around at your school. I think most people are familiar with silver gulls from going to the beach. Then there are pied cormorants. Cormorants are, I think some people call them shags. They are a bird that you find at the ocean a lot. They are characterized by their white underfeathers and their black wings. They are a bigger bird. They're probably the biggest bird on this page. They have that distinctive curved yellow beak, and they like to fan out their wings and dry them. So if you see a big black and white bird drying out its wings and sunbaking, it's probably a pied cormorant. Lastly, there's welcome swallows, which are the little birds that zip around bodies of water, and sometimes ovals as well. They have a very distinctive kite, very angular shape, and you would definitely need a pair of binoculars or a camera to really see that it was a welcome swallow, because they're small and they zip around. So it's most common to identify welcome swallows by the shape of their wings. We can't talk about birds in schools without talking about the beloved bin chicken. We have 2 different types of ibises in Victoria. The Australian white ibis and straw-necked ibis. The Australian white ibis is the one that you're most familiar with. Probably it's got the, like, I think of them as like a Disney villain face, that bold black head, and then they have their white feathers. And then you have the way more beautiful straw-necked ibis with the metallic sheen feathers. And the straw-necked ibis you usually see hanging out at ovals. And I've heard that straw-necked ibis are a bit of an indicator for how good the environment is, because they're a lot more picky than Australian white ibis. Australian white ibis, as you know, get their reputation for being bin chickens, but they're really, really well adapted to hanging out in urban areas. So I think we don't give them enough credit for that. But straw-necked ibises really prefer a more natural landscape. So they're more of a, like an indicator ibis. Okay, so I very, very briefly ran down some of the birds you might see at your school, and now you're familiar with them. What can you do with this bird information? So you can organize for your ResourceSmart facilitator to come to your school and help you with your biodiversity audit. There's a section in the audit for noting every animal that you see on your school grounds, and a lot of them may be birds. So maybe now's the time to get inspired to do your biodiversity audit. You could also participate in a bird count and upload your data to a citizen science app like iNaturalist, Bird Data, or eBird. And this is a really great way for your students to be real life scientists and put the information of the species they find in their school out into the world to be used in real life research. And if you hope to see more birds in your bird count than you did, why not create more habitat on your school grounds? Why not create more old logs, plant more trees, have different stories of vegetation, put in some nest boxes? There are so many opportunities to increase the bird life in your school and make a really great bird ecosystem. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the birds that you might find in your school. If you want any more information, consult your bird ID book, or go through this video more slowly, have a look at the birds. But it's a really great idea to have a conversation with the students in your class, because I think you'll find they know a lot more birds than you think, and they often have stories associated with when they saw a magpie, when their brother got their sandwich stolen by a kookaburra. I think that's a common thread in Australia, is a lot of people have a story about a bird stealing their lunch. So it's a really rewarding conversation to have, to find out how your students are connecting to country and their experiences with the wildlife around them. So thank you so much for listening to this talk, and stay tuned for the next one. Bye.